All right, good morning, good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing fine. Welcome to this new session, Identiverse. And yeah, feel free to write some messages in the public chat. I can see them on a separate screen. Really excited to be here to be talking a little bit about authorization, the latest trends, the latest standards that have come up in the past couple of years. My name is David Broussard. I work at Salesforce as a product manager in identity, and I have a background in authorization. So with that being said, let's jump right in. So somewhere online, 2021 AD, we're all trying to do our jobs, trying to cope with COVID-19. Some of us are lucky enough to be attending the conference live. Some of us are actually sitting in their PJs somewhere. I am not. I'm proudly wearing my Identiverse t-shirt. And the topic at hand today is, I'm sure, the most fascinating topic you could ever pick at a conference. It's authorization. So authorization, you're probably going to tell me, is when you get authentication wrong, right? After all, when you type in your username and your password on a website, what happens? You get HTTP 401, and what is that called? It's called unauthorized. Therefore, authorization is the opposite of authentication. Not quite. I think the folks, when they named the authorization, the HTTP codes way back in the day, they got a little too excited and called 401 unauthorized, which is one of my #1 pet peeves. It's a misnomer. 403 would be more adequate. When you're trying to do something, you can't do it, you're not authorized to do it, therefore you should be getting a 403. 403 is called forbidden, by the way. So authorization isn't really when you get authentication wrong. Okay, well, that's fine. If it's not about it, then maybe OAuth is authorization. After all, we might have forgotten the original meaning of OAuth, but it does stand for open authorization, right? So authorization is OAuth, end of talk. You all know OAuth. I don't need to do this presentation. Let's just go back to the bar and have a drink at 7:30 in the morning. Not quite. OAuth, we're going to dive deeper into OAuth and all its derivatives and profiles. OAuth is about access delegation. Think when you have your Twitter account, you have your Facebook account, and you want to let your Twitter account post on your Facebook, you're giving Twitter access to your Facebook in a constrained way. You're letting Twitter right on your wall, for instance. That is what OAuth is about, delegating that access. It's not about authorization per se. Okay, I'm getting notes. Can you see my slides? Can you hear me? You can go ahead and write in the chat. So I get a yes. Can you hear me? Cool. We're live. Guys, you were tricking me pretending I wasn't live. Okay, it's a good thing I didn't do anything silly. All righty, so authorization, in a nutshell, is about granting or denying an entity access to another entity. That's possibly the broadest definition, and I'll give another one later and compare it with authentication. So here you have King Arthur on the left, and King Arthur wants to get access to the Grail. So this is his quest to the Holy Grail, and authorization is going to be all those things on the way or in the way that will be preventing him from getting access to the Grail or enabling him to get access to the Grail. And for those of you who've seen the movie, there's a link to the movie at the end of the presentation. There is one major thing that gets in the way of King Arthur getting access to the Grail, and that's this pesky French. Thinking about a couple of you in the chat there. Not going to name any names. So with that in mind, let's have a look at some more specific definitions and requirements. Authentication really is about confirming that a user is who they say they are. More broadly, though, authentication is about proving something about yourself. Okay? If I go to a bar and I want to drink, all I need to do is prove that I'm 21 years of age or 18 years of age, depending on where you live. I don't really need to prove where I live or who I am. I just need to prove my age. When I'm driving a car, I need to authenticate that I have the right to drive. Okay, I'm proving a claim about myself. That's the broadest possible sense or definition of what authentication is. It's not necessarily about identity. Similarly, authorization is about using those authenticated claims about you or other information that is going to be used to determine whether you can get access to a resource. So it's an entity getting access to another entity. And bear in mind that authorization can work both ways. It's not only about granting access, it could also be about denying access. Oftentimes, the legacy frameworks and ways of doing authorization, they're all about opening up doors, but you could also think that authorization should be capable of restricting doors. Okay? So keep that in the back of your minds. So why is it called the Holy Grail? Why did I call my presentation the Holy Grail? I mean, if authorization is just the next step after authentication, I mean, surely it should be just as easy as authentication is. You know, you just define a way to authenticate your user and you're done. But that's not quite it, though. Because while identity management belongs entirely or almost entirely into the hands of the IT admin team or the IT teams within your company, think of the owners of AAD or the owners of your identity as a service product. It's typically the one IT team. The challenge with authorization is it spans across multiple domains. It's not just about who you are, it's what you want to do. And then what you want to do definitely does not belong in the hands of the IT team. It belongs in the hands of those developing applications. Oh, wait a minute. So now you have multiple stakeholders? Ooh, that gets a little messy. Who defines the requirements and when and who actually configures the system? And how is that authorization system applied to what it is you want to protect? It's messy. There is not one single stakeholder, and that is why it makes authorization so much harder, okay? Because it's just not the one team driving those requirements. So to guide the conversation and to guide you in your quest for better authorization, I've put together a series of requirements and definitions, and then we'll dive deeper into the existing standards and what you can do with those existing standards. But first off, here are 5 authorization requirements, and yes, I do know how to count. So number 1, you want your authorization to be configurable and decoupled. And what I mean by that is when you're building an app or a system or a set of processes, you want to decouple the authorization logic from that app, from that system, from that process so that they can both evolve independently. Imagine that you're building a banking app. Okay, great. And you're being given requirements from the PCI team, from the GDPR team, from potentially the business authorization team that says, oh, I want you to do this. I want you to be able to give access to bank accounts to the parents and the guardians and the children, so on and so forth. Well, you don't want to have to rewrite your app every single time the authorization requirements change. So you want the authorization to be decoupled from the app, and you want it to be configurable. You don't want it to be code. You want it to be something that can be updated very quickly. And that takes us to the second point here, which is you want your authorization framework to be future-proof. You have authorization requirements today, and you want those requirements to be addressed by the framework tomorrow. So whatever you pick, be it a policy-based system or a role-based system, you want that system to be able to tackle future needs. And of course, hindsight is always 20/20, but it's really hard to pick a framework with the foresight of what is going to come down the road. But try to keep that in the back of your mind. And then lastly, number 5, you want your authorization to be auditable. What I mean by that is, if it wasn't for security, if it wasn't for the audit team or the governance team, you probably could just do authorization within your own app. You don't really care. But if you want authorization to be visible, then you have to do it separately from the app, and you want it to be auditable. So you want to have an authorization artifact that will give you that auditability, that traceability, so that you can actually prove to your auditors that, yep, the right thing happened at the right time. Now, one of my favorite one of my favorite slides is this one here, the authorization Venn, and it's not because I live in Vancouver. I wish Alex Babianu could do the drums in the background here. This is my favorite diagram because it really shows the full breadth of what authorization is. If you take authentication and identity, it's just the one circle. You know everything about the user and all the claims and attributes and metadata about the user around identity. But it's not just that, right? King Arthur in the bottom left wants to get access to the Grail. Well, which Grail? Is there more than one? Are there attributes around that Grail that I can use in my authorization decision process? And of course, it's not just who you are and what it is you want to get access to. It's also what it is you want to do on that thing, what the action is. And then lastly, it's also the contextual information, you know, time of day, geolocation, IP restrictions, other dynamic attributes or dynamic information that come into play at the time when you want to do the authorization. So whenever you think of your authorization requirements, think in terms of this Venn and try to classify or break down your requirements into these 3 different buckets. What are the different kinds of authorization? This is actually interesting because when we think authorization, we tend to think about the one in the middle, transactional authorization, especially when you're thinking about APIs, but also when you're thinking about web apps and business processes, you have a transaction. Alice or King Arthur, they want to get access to a specific item. Alice wants to view account 123. That's a transaction, typically what you would do through a REST endpoint, for instance. And it's really easy to ask the authorization question that corresponds to that business transaction. Okay, Alice wants to view account 123. Can she view account 123? And that question, we know everything about the user, or we can know everything about the user because we know the key, Alice. We know the action that she wants to do, view, and we know what it is she wants to view, account 123. So it's a fully qualified transactional question that you get to ask. Authorization frameworks typically are very good at tackling this type of authorization. The second type going left is functional authorization, which is perhaps what we used to do way back when in the 90s when we built web apps or built desktop apps and we wanted to know whether to show this menu, that button, that feature. In functional authorization, what we want to know is, can the user as a whole do this thing? Can the user as a whole print? Should we enable the print button on the screen? So functional authorization is going to be really, really useful when it comes to building up UIs, but also when it comes to generating claims dynamically in an OAuth OpenID architecture. If you wanted to add claims to your response, you could actually use your authorization framework to determine dynamically which claims to return. I'm sure there was a great 90s show back in the 90s, plenty of good shows back in the 90s. The third type of authorization is a little newer, and that's data-centric authorization. It's newer in the sense that we've always had data, but of course, the place of data and the amount of data has really grown over time. So now, when you think about authorization, not only do you want to do transactional authorization, but you also want to do authorization at scale. You want to be able to control access to millions of records or potentially an unknown number of records. And in that case, you can't really ask the question, can I view record 1? Can I view record 2? Can I view record 3? It just would not scale. And besides, you might not even know the record identifiers. So you have to ask what we call an open-ended authorization request. Tell me which accounts Alice can view. And we'll see when we get to the frameworks and the models how these different frameworks tackle that question. Now, one more dimension of authorization is who gets to define authorization. Given my background, I'm very biased on enterprise-driven authorization, meaning that you're building an app, you're a developer of the company, you're building an app, a banking app, and therefore the company, the bank, will decide what the authorization requirements are. That's enterprise-driven authorization. The IRS is a really good example of enterprise-driven authorization. They decide who can view tax data, who can do certain things within the tax processes, right? But sometimes there's user-driven requirements as well. Going back to the tax example, it might be that you want to give access to your particular tax returns to a particular accountant. That's user-driven authorization. You are the one deciding that, yep, my tax information, I want someone else to be able to see it, view it. So that's user-driven authorization. And these are 2 different types of authorization that will be addressed through potentially different frameworks or different standards. Another dimension, when do we authorize? Okay, do we do it when you want to get access to that thing you're trying to get access to? Or do we do it at birth when we give you entitlements? Take King Arthur. He was born a king. Actually, not quite. He had to pull Excalibur from the stone first. But let's just assume that he was born a king. That's design time authorization. He's a king. He can do so many different things based on the fact that he's a king. At runtime, though, during his quest to find the Grail, he will have challenges, and there and then he will be authorized or denied access to the next step. Okay? Runtime authorization will enable things like dynamic authorization, dynamic access control, and the ability to look at contextual information. Design time authorization is really convenient because you do it at the very beginning. It's static, it's easy to govern, it's easy to manage, you get good visibility, but it doesn't give you runtime authorization, and it's not capable of looking into additional information that relate to what it is you want to get access to. Design time authorization oftentimes will leave the resource out of the authorization equation. One last item I want to bring up is drawing the line between authorization and business logic. Oftentimes, my customers in my previous life would ask me, well, this authorization thing, like letting a parent get access to a child bank account, I mean, that's something I could just write in my own app. Why do you want me to express it as authorization decoupled from the app? Well, the reason is the following. My rule of thumb is the following. If you want to be able to audit your authorization, if you want to be able to prove that you're doing the right thing, if you want to be able to prove that you're in compliance with GDPR or another piece of legislation, then you probably want to express it in authorization. If, however, what it is you're trying to express is just pure business, has no security value, no authorization value, then stick it into the business logic. A good example that came from a banking customer a few years ago is they have a credit card business and they want to be able to send a paper bill to their customers. But they also want to let their customers decide whether they want a paper bill or paperless billing for their credit cards. And so they had a rule that went along the lines of, if the customer has chosen paperless, send them an email. If they've chosen paper, send them a letter and regular mail. Now, they also wanted to say that if a customer has missed a payment in the last 45 days, then disregard the preference and send them a paper bill anyway. And they were asking me, well, should I do that in authorization? Should I have a policy that states, oh, if the customer has failed to pay in the last 45 days, send them a paper bill regardless of their preference? And my answer is no, because that's business logic. Bertrand, to answer your question, the whole decision to send a paper letter to the customer so that they pay their credit card bill, unless there is an authorization requirement or a legal requirement behind it, I would not put that in authorization. I would let it be within the business app. So you could argue, why even bother? I mean, you're telling us all these different things about authorization. I've been doing ABAC forever. It works fine. I mean, it was defined in the 90s. It's just okay. It scales okay. Someone else might say, well, I can do all of that in code. So why even bother? It's just so much quicker to write my piece of Java, my whatever. And then, of course, the guy in the middle, the third nice, is saying, oh, no, I want policies. I want to be able to configure my authorization as policies. So why even bother? Well, as you'll see, there's clearly benefits to decoupling your authorization from your app to be able to grow more quickly, to be able to adapt more quickly, to be able to have transparency in the authorization. Yeah, Nikolai, that's a really good point. If another good rule of thumb is, if there's a regulation that forces you to do something, then most likely you want to have that visible and auditable. So it's a good thing to put in an authorization policy instead of having it in code, because having it in code is going to be much harder to prove it. And then another battle wound from my days in the authorization world, we had a customer who literally told us in investment banking, they literally told us, oh, when we do audits, we just take a screenshot of the code my developers wrote, we give that to the auditors. Well, the audit is not going to be very good quality if you do that, because now you're telling your auditors you have to understand what the code does. And of course, auditors are not meant to understand what that code does. So let's have a look at existing approaches. First of all, a couple of definitions. I'm talking about model, standard, framework. Model is going to be an abstract way to tackle authorization. Think ACL, RBAC, ABAC. These are the three main models you have today, right? So access control lists, role-based access control, and attribute-based access control. A standard is going to be a formal way of implementing one of those models. So think things that stem from the IETF, from OASIS, things like XACML, XACML, OAuth. And then the last item here is a framework. And the line between framework and standard can be a little fuzzy. A good framework that is on the verge of becoming a standard in a way is Open Policy Agent. But there's many more frameworks. If you look at every single programming language or a lot of SaaS apps, you'll realize that they do have some form of fine-grained authorization or authorization frameworks within their languages. Java has Jazz. Spring has Spring Security, Ruby has CanCan, and then their newer version is CanCan. I can't wait for version 4 of that standard or that framework. It's probably going to be called CanCan, and we can go on forever and ever. So these are what I mean when I talk about model, standard, and framework. With that in mind, lo and behold, the old authorization graph, or perhaps the map King Arthur was holding in the movie to try to get from A to B, and no wonder it took so long to find their way. So At the very center, we have authorization. On the top right corner, let's start with the purple stuff. We have the models, okay? So like I said, access control lists, role-based access control, attribute-based access control. RBAC and ABAC are formally defined by NIST. They have excellent resources on both topics. I really, really recommend you go read their stuff, okay? Especially the ABAC paper they wrote, I think 5 years ago, is really, really good. So I really recommend you go there. Moving left to standards in blue, you have the whole family of standards from OASIS, SAML, and XACML, the good, old, and trusted. You have IETF that are all very identity-centric. We'll get into that in a minute. So OAuth and all of its derivatives. And there's a mistake there. There should not be an arrow between GNAP and OAuth. I apologize. And then you have NGAC, or Next Generation Access Control, which is a standard from NIST, direct implementation of ABAC. And then you also have user managed access at Kantara. But it's not just technical standards. You also have industry standards. I only listed one here, HL7 and FHIR, which are in the healthcare sector. But if you work in a given industry, banking, insurance, healthcare, go look at the standards that belong to your industry, because there is probably a framework that someone has put together to tackle authorization. And if anything, you can probably ride that wave, and it's going to make it easier for you to implement your own authorization in your own environment. And then lastly, you have frameworks. And in frameworks, you have what I'll call the pragmatic approach to anything. So instead of following a standard, you go and implement your own approach. You put it within your own environment. So for your developers using that environment, it's just so much easier to pick up. Open policy is a great example of that. Developing a framework for authorization within the Kubernetes environment, within this whole infrastructure deployment environment. They could also be vendor specific. AWS is a great example of implementing ABAC for AWS resources based on tags, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. SDDL within Windows Server is a great way to do fine-grained authorization on files and folders. And there's many more. So you got your Ruby here, your Spring Security, and so on and so forth. If we lay them out on a timeline, many, many, many moons ago, you had access control lists. I wasn't born. I'm not going to talk about them. And then in 1992, we start to see the first formalization of RBAC. It actually was not really formalized as a standard until the early 2000s, but the actual first mention and paper, seminal paper in RBAC by NIST, by David Ferraiolo, came out in 1992. And then in the early 2000s, we see the wave of WS Star and the SOA frenzy. And that's when XACML and SAML came up, but also WS Security, WS Trust, WS, you fill in the blank, WS Federation, so on and so forth. So XACML and SAML are actually pretty old standards, 20 years old this year, still going strong, but also very biased to technologies from 2001, aka XML. Fast forward 10 years, we're now moving into the realm of REST and JSON. We have new protocols like OAuth 2.0 that, again, is about access delegation, not authorization. You have new things like the abbreviated language for authorization alpha that makes XACML simpler than what it was. You have NGAC right in the back of that. Then fast forward 5 years, move to 2015. Right after ABAC is formally defined by NIST, you have new standards like UMA, user managed access, open policy agent, the JSON profile of XACML. So all these things that are meant to make a developer's life easier when it comes to implementing authorization. Fast forward to 2019, Google comes out with their paper on their way of tackling authorization called Zanzibar. And then fast forward a little bit more to today and tomorrow, we have new profiles, new standards at IETF popping up, things like GNAP by Justin Richer, things like JWT Access Tokens by Vittorio Bertorci, or the OAuth Rich Authorization Requests. So let's dive a little deeper into what each one of those standards do and how they can help you. But first, let's take a breather. Let's go back to the movie, and let's go back to the knights who say NIST. NIST. NIST, as you all know, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I hope I didn't get the acronym wrong. And it's a great bunch of people working on standards that relate to IT, not only authorization, but also other standards. And in particular, for the world of authorization, they did 3 fundamental things. Number 1, they defined RBAC in 92. They formalized it in 2004. Back in 2013, they introduced ABAC. ABAC introduces policies, attributes and an authorization architecture. So it's essentially learning from the RBAC experience and expanding it into the world of fine grained authorization with ABAC, with attributes, with a better architecture. And then, like I said on the previous slide, they also implement their own framework called NGAC, or their own standard that implements attribute-based access control. So, first set of standards are the ones I call the identity-derived authorization standards. These are standards that look at half the equation. And in those standards, you have SAML for federation, but also some basic authorization capabilities in SAML. You have user-managed access for user-driven authorization and granting access from one user to another user. And then under IETF, you have OAuth, of course. You have Rich Authorization Requests, which is a great step at bridging OAuth and policy-based authorization frameworks. You have JWT access tokens, and then you have GNAP. Think of identity-derived authorization as a means to prove something about yourself that might be used in authorization. It could be a role, it could be a permission, it could be a profile, it could be a claim, okay? These are the different things. So here you've got John Cleese saying, hey, I'm Sir Lancelot. I'm from Camelot. It rhymes too. I'm a knight. I'm a knight of King Arthur's. So these are all attributes and claims of the user of the identity. So GNAP is a relatively new, initiative around defining additional flows that OAuth does not cover. So in a way, GNAP is also about access delegation. It's also about providing flows so that users can authorize themselves to one app or another. Now, where GNAP falls short of being proper authorization is it doesn't really define access control, much like OAuth, by the way. It only still focuses on access delegation, and it focuses on the different flows between the different parties, the RP, the SP, the IDP. It doesn't really focus on the actual access authorization. The next one here is JWT access tokens, and that's a little more interesting because what we're doing here is that we're choosing to use an understandable format, JWT, instead of an opaque access token. And if we start doing that, then those JWT access tokens can carry information that can be used as parts of an authorization process. If the token is opaque, then we can't really use it. But if the token is not opaque anymore, then it can actually carry that information that could be used for authorization or other purposes. So JWT access tokens might actually make your authorization life a little easier. Example here, I'm Arthur, hey, son of Uther Pendragon, from the castle of Camelot. I'm king of the Britons, defeater of the Saxons, sovereign of all England. Whew, what a mouthful. And I thought he was French. The new standard that I'm really excited about is the Rich Authorization Requests. And the whole point of the Rich Authorization Request is to be able to carry an authorization question and a set of attributes into the initial request that goes to the identity provider and an OAuth flow. Okay. So it will let you be able to ask better questions when you're doing your OAuth or OpenID Connect dance. For instance, you can now start saying things like, let me make a payment with the amount of 45 euros or 45, whatever the currency was back in the day in England. Or give me access to folder A and write access to file X. And if you look at the Rich Authorization Request, an example of which I have on the following slide, you'll realize that it's extremely similar to what an open policy agent request would look like or a XACML JSON authorization request would look like, which to me means that you can actually plug in those two standards together, and it's going to help us bridge the identity side of authorization to the attribute side or the policy side of authorization. The authors of the standard have also planned to make Rich Authorization Requests compatible with or combinable with scopes and claims, so you can actually increase the number of authorization checks. This is what a sample request would look like. Essentially, it's very simple. It's a set of key value pairs. Sometimes there are arrays, but essentially key value pairs that describe the question that you want to ask. So here you're saying, I want to get account information. I want to be able to list accounts, read balances. I want to do initiate status cancel. I want to transfer 123 euros. So it's a lot of information that you're sending into your request to the IDP. And then the one thing that's not really covered in the standard is how that authorization request is being processed. But that's okay, because we'll be able to plug in the the authorization framework in the back. Another identity-based standard is user-managed access. Remember I said there's enterprise-driven authorization, there's also user-driven authorization. Well, this is it, it's user-managed access. And of course, it's a slightly different kind of knight, which is why I have UMA here instead of having King Arthur. It's also because it's UMA. User-managed access is a way to use OAuth so that you can enable constrained delegation of one app or one system or one set of data for another user. For instance, if we look at this cute little picture, King Arthur uses Scroll Online to store data about the Grail. Okay, King Arthur hires Lancelot to work on the Grail. Lancelot was a mercenary, so he didn't have access to the information. But as soon as King Arthur hires Lancelot, Arthur can share that subset of data with Lancelot, and that can be defined in UMA. It can be defined through consent management. As a result of which, Lancelot can get access to Grail data. Boom, Lancelot's happy. He knows where to go. And then later in the quest, Arthur and Lancelot fight over Guinevere. Arthur's not happy. Arthur removes his consent to share the data, and suddenly Lancelot no longer has access to that data. So that's what UMA can help you define, those delegation flows, those consent management flows. So we've talked in the first 30 minutes, I know we only got 15 minutes to go, so I'll try to be fast. We've talked mainly about the identity-centric standards. The challenge, the main challenge I see with identity-centric authorization is it does not tackle relationships. That's the number one thing, okay? It is definitely easier to audit and manage role-based access control because given it's all identity-based, it's just the one team handling the authorization. However, you don't necessarily know how your apps and developers are using those roles and permissions and profiles. So you're under the impression that you're doing a right audit because you're auditing your roles and permissions, but the reality is you're missing half of the equation, okay? With identity-centric authorization, typically your permissions and your authorizations are defined at birth time, at design time, when the user is created or updated. And you do rely on your apps to tackle the authorization. So the only real good thing about ABAC is it's potentially a little easier to manage. Although, with that being said, what happens with ABAC is you suddenly have role explosions. Of course, scope explosion and token bloat. So ABAC does not scale well. In particular, it does not scale well to the world we live in today, where we have many microservices, many APIs, many systems, a lot of data, much data. So you want something that can scale better. And that's where moving to the other side of the equation, to the other side of the fence, we're going to start looking at ABAC. The thing is, ABAC's not new, right? It was formalized by NIST about 7 years ago, but a lot of the startups that worked in the ABAC field started, I want to say, roughly 20 years ago. And in between RBAC and ABAC, there is that bridge. It's the bridge of death, remember, with that little gnarly gnome protecting or defending that bridge of death. And like the name says, it's kind of dangerous to go on that bridge. And of course, right below that bridge, you have the Gorge of Eternal Peril, which doesn't sound much nicer than the bridge itself. And so the question is, how can you easily move from no, I don't like Monty Python at all. I hate that movie. How can you move from RBAC to ABAC real easily? How can you make that transition smoothly? So things like Rich Authorization Requests are actually a good hand in the right direction. And so to help you guide on your journey to ABAC, there's a couple of things that I used to do in my previous life that I think you can follow too. And these are essentially a life cycle, if you will, a step that goes around the things you need to do. So going from top to bottom, left to right, number one, you want to identify your requirements, your plain old English requirements of the app, not authorization. Example, I want to build an app. I want to build an app that can browse bank accounts. Great. Second step is you want to identify your authorization requirements. Well, a user can view their own accounts. A user can view their children's accounts. A user can transfer up to $500 daily. I'll give you my bank account number so you guys can try out that policy. Once you've done your authorization requirements, you can go ahead and identify those attributes. So if we look at a user can view their own accounts, you have the notion of a user, you have the notion of an action view, you have the notion of an object type account. So these are your attributes: account, account owner, balance, and so on and so forth. Then you want to implement your policies. And we're going to talk about the standards that exist in the realm of fine-grained authorization. But essentially, you have three main languages that exist out there: Alpha, XACML, Open Policy Agent. All three are roughly equivalent, roughly. Then you want to design and deploy your architecture. What I mean by that is it's great to define your authorization policies, but you also have to have a means to enforce. You have to have the glue that integrates your authorization framework and your application or APIs or systems that you want to control access to. And then lastly, to close the loop, you want to be able to audit. And two types of audit you have to think about: audit of what happened and audit of what can potentially happen. So what happened is easy. You look at your application logs, you look at your authorization request response logs, and you can determine what happened. Authorization of what can happen is going to be analyzing the policies and understanding what access they give you. So ABAC, in a nutshell, is the way to go. You can see John Cleese, the pesky Frenchman, telling you ABAC is the way to go. And ABAC, the way that it works, you might have heard the term PBAC or Dynamic Authorization Management. They're all the same thing. ABAC essentially says that you have a policy-based model. It could be XACML, it could be Alpha, it could be Open Policy Agent. You have a set of attributes, essentially key value pairs. It's as simple as that. And you can have any number of attributes. And those attributes could be about who you are, what it is you want to do, what action you want to do, when you want to do it, why you want to do it. So it's the different dimensions of authorization. ABAC also defines how you ask a question and how you get an answer back, so request response protocol. And then finally, ABAC also defines a means to fetch additional metadata, additional attributes, if you're missing any information. Think back to the question, can Arthur get access to the Grail? Well, who's Arthur? Is it Arthur, my neighbor from down the street, or is it Arthur the king? So you need to figure out those additional attributes, that additional metadata, and that's what ABAC lets you do. Here's a very high-level architecture, comes straight from Wikipedia. You'll recognize the terms. They were defined in XACML. They were also defined in ABAC. They're also super old. Some of those terms date back to the 70s and network access control. Okay, so they're not necessarily specific to XACML or attribute-based access control or even Open Policy Agent. But at the core of it, you have your engine, your policy decision point. That's the piece that will decide for you. And then you have the glue that associates the policy decision point with what it is you want to protect. That's your policy enforcement point. The policy enforcement point could be many different things. It could be an API gateway. It could be a handler, many different things. Then you have the administration point for policy authoring, and you have the information point for gathering additional attributes. So XACML, established in 2001, as you saw, defines the policy language, defines an architecture, provides a set of ecosystems so that you can integrate with different languages, Java, .NET, APIs, so on and so forth. It's for general purpose authorization. Now, you might have heard the following. The internet saying, bring out your dead. Okay. The analyst saying, here's one, and that one is XACML. No, XACML is not dead. It's actually getting better. So XACML, yes, is old, and yes, it's XML-based, but there is a new version of XACML called Alpha that makes the syntax so much nicer, so much easier for developers to use. And that's the direction that XACML is evolving in, making it easier for developers to use, making it easier to audit as well. So yes, there is a future for XACML. Moving on. Next generation access control, the standard defined by NIST. The one thing that's interesting about the standard is that they start using graph as a foundation for authorization. So they're moving away from policy-based approach, they're moving to a graph-based approach. And in speaking to the different individuals involved in authorization, that's a trend that I've noticed, potentially using graph as a means to express authorization rather than policies. And if you do that, then you can use all of the tooling that come around graphs. Moving forward, Open Policy Agent. That's the newest kid on the block. Started in 2015, graduated from CNCF in 2021. Open Policy Agent is what I'm going to call pragmatic authorization. They looked at a challenge, they looked at developer population, and they tried to make it as easy as possible for developers to actually write authorization. Their syntax is called Rego. Okay, you can write pretty much roughly the same sort of authorization policies in Rego as you can in Alpha. And here I have a couple of differences between the two. So one of the major differences between the two languages, between Open Policy Agent and XACML, is that XACML is tree structured and it can be any depth. OPA is generally a flat structure, a little bit like network access control policies. Another aspect is that in Open Policy Agent, historically, you cannot retrieve attributes from third-party sources, from the policy information points. You can do that in XACML. I think Open Policy Agent in newer versions has addressed this with a REST callout, so that's good. It's great because it lets you enrich your authorization flow. And then last thing, the request response. XACML defines a strict schema. Open Policy Agent does not. So it's always up to the policy to determine how to use the information that came in. In XACML, it's not. The schema tells you how to use that information. But it does tell me that there is actually room for an open policy agent profile of XACML to bridge the two together. So stay tuned, because that's something that we might be working on in the future. Now, something that came up in my conversations as well is that at the end, at the end of the day, the language that you choose, as long as it can express your authorization requirements, it doesn't really matter. Yes, you want to be able to write your policies easily, so you want a language that's easy to write. So probably not XML. But Alpha and OPA would do really well. But then what you want to do is you can mix and match your authorization engines in your languages, and now you're going to need a governance layer on top to be able to manage all of your policies together. Also, keep in mind that OPA tends to be biased towards infrastructure. Not only it can move up, and XACML and Alpha tend to be API and application biased. Not only they can move down, so both can be used in both places. Note how UMA can be plugged into authorization through a PIP, for instance. So UMA can enrich the authorization flow. The main challenge with ABAC is the fact that it mixes different teams, the IT team, the application team, the business team, and it's really, really hard to get everyone to agree, okay? Also, the architecture, does it have to be centralized, or can it be decentralized? One trend that we're seeing more and more is the notion of a sidecar, being able to put your authorization engines right next to the app that you want to protect. That's totally legit. ABAC does not force you to go down one centralized architecture. No, it enables you to put your authorization engines wherever you want to put them. Audit is a little harder than it is with RBAC, but there are proprietary tools from vendors that address that need. For instance, Axiomatics or Open Policy Agent both have techniques to handle better audits. So the bottom line is the standards that you have within ABAC, within RBAC, they're great. They're a great first step. They're a really good foundation. However, you have gaps in authorization that only vendors address in their own secret sauce. So I would caution you to look at what the secret sauce is and make your choices based on that, but also try not to be too tightly coupled to a particular vendor. Tying OAuth with ABAC looks a little like this. You can actually deploy enforcement points within your authorization server and within the resource server that can go back to a policy decision point, either for design time authorization to get additional dynamically generated claims, or for actual runtime authorization. So OAuth can plug in right into ABAC, either XACML or Alpha or Open Policy Agent. And then more specifically, you can have rich authorization requests to help you standardize that pattern. So within the authorization server, you can have a rich authorization request go right to the policy decision point and get an authorization decision. Wrapping it up in the last couple minutes that I have, remember in the movie, there's a story about a swallow. And the question is it an African swallow or a European swallow? And you might be like, what does a swallow have to do with authorization? Well, back in 2019, this happened. Google came up with something called Zanzibar. And yes, before it was a Google paper, it was actually an island, still is an island off the coast of Africa, where African swallows probably come from. Google Zanzibar is essentially a way to tackle authorization at scale. So their requirement, their original need was performance and scale and distributed systems, but essentially it's a glorified way to handle access control lists. However, there is work happening to take Zanzibar and the work spent in Zanzibar to move it to an ABAC-like approach. So companies like AuthZ are trying to address ABAC requirements using Zanzibar or using the underlying technology of Zanzibar. So stay tuned for that. It's relatively new developments. Now, last couple slides, I promised to let you go. I happen to live next door to a guy who loves graphs. As to why he loves graphs, I don't know, but he's been telling me about graphs forever. And as it turns out, 3 years ago, I was moderating one of his talks at Identiverse. His name is Alex. I'm sure he's listening. I hope he's listening. He better be listening. And he was telling me, well, why don't you use graph instead of policies for authorization? So that's very much in line with NGAC. What if you could express authorization with two nodes, the user and the object, and then you can link the two with a relationship, and boom, you could get authorization. So graph might be something worth looking at in the future. And here is Alex trying to convince me on one of our tracks that graph is the way to go. Okay, wrapping it up. My favorite color is red, no blue. The bottom line is the authorization world is growing really, really, really fast. Okay, there are like twice as many startups as there were in the past. XACML XML syntax is dead, but XACML, the principle, isn't. XACML Alpha and OPA are essentially the same things. Graph-based authorization might be interesting, so keep an eye on that. Vendors will still have their own frameworks, and really AWS IAM is a great illustration of how you can get authorization right. And then what really matters is the ability for you to easily author, manage, and audit your policies. So make that happen. So the Grail of authorization is you want it to be developer-minded, so your developers can use that authorization framework real easily. You want it to be relevant, have an ecosystem to integrate with, business-oriented for your business users to be able to understand the authorization framework, audit-enabled so that you can actually prove that you're doing the right authorization checks, and that you have a good lifecycle and governance process across your policies, across your authorization artifacts. So before I wrap it up, I really want to say thanks to all of these individuals who helped me put the presentation together. Great feedback from them. I'll be sharing more notes after the talk, so if you're interested, just let me know. A couple of additional reading material, plus the link to the movie on Netflix, probably more interesting than talking about authorization. And one last question before I let you go, with 34 seconds to spare. What is your favorite authorization standard? With that, thank you very much. If you have any questions, just feel free to write them in the chat and I'll be happy to tackle them.